Welcome to this EMS Web training session. During this session, we are going to be talking about creating findings. Typically, findings are created from the audit or inspection. And so there are multiple ways of creating a finding from the audit or inspection. You can do it from the checklists that are filled out and part of the audit or inspection. You can create one directly from the audit inspection profile, or you can use the copy finding function on the audit inspection profile. Outside of an audit or inspection, you can go to the Finding tab and create a finding from there as well. And finally, you can create what is known as a carryover finding, which is taking a finding from a previous inspection or audit, closing out that finding, and then creating a new instance of it in the new audit or inspection. So we'll cover all of that during this training session. Please note that there is written Word document guidance that is located at the EMS Web site map and guidance link, which is located on the right-hand side pane under Quick Links on most EMS web pages. So then just scroll down to the audit inspection area, and then you can look for the relevant information under the external, internal, or carryover finding hyperlinks. So each one of those will open up Word documents. So while we're in EMS Web, there is a Finding tab under the Audit Inspection tab. And so this lists all of the open findings for the installation. And so you can search and look at any of these findings. You can also create and copy findings from this point. Do note that the button says New Independent Finding, and that's because this finding will not be tied to any existing audit or inspection. Please note that you can edit an independent finding and later tie it to an existing audit or inspection. If we look at an existing inspection, you can see that we have a button on the inspection profile for new finding. And so if you click on that, it'll open up the finding form, and none of the information will be pre-populated, and the user will have to manually key in all of the information. There is another way to create a new finding, and that is from the filled out checklist. So if you're filling out a checklist, then it's easiest just to create a finding from that checklist. And so in this training example, that is what we'll do. But you could just as easily create it from this point under New Finding. Either way, from this New Finding button or from the checklist, both ways the finding is tied to this individual inspection. So I'm going to click on the user's view and fill out checklist items. And this is a recurring inspection, so there's one for each week. So I'm going to pick April 5th. And for this particular inspection, there are 4 EMS items being inspected. So I'm going to pick device number 4, anti-syncing device number 4. So I'm going to click on Enter to fill out the checklist. And I'm just going to mark everything as compliant except for one question where I'm going to create a finding. Okay, so let's see. Let's take a look at one of these questions. So we have this question, large quantity handlers of universal waste are required to meet specific accumulation time limits. So I'm going to pretend that I went to here and I noted something. Let's say the storage time was 1 year, and then a drum of used fluorescent lamps were found that had been stored there for 2 years. Okay, so a nice simple finding. So I've entered in a comment here. I'm going to say they were non-compliant, and then I'm going to add a finding. Okay, so when we look at all of the fields here, you have a finding number, and that's auto-generated. In some cases, your installation may have may not want to use the auto-generated finding number, and in that case, you can set it manually. But the auto-generated number will have information such as the installation UIC, the type of finding, the year, the finding number, or the number of that type of finding that has been entered in, and so on. Organization is preset, evaluation title, so that's the name of the checklist that it came from. The auditor is assumed to be the person entering in the finding. You can change it if you desire. Media is carried over from the checklist. Data observed is defaulted to the current date. If it was observed earlier and you're only just getting around to writing the finding now, you can go in and change the date. So let's say it was actually observed yesterday. Area observed also gets pre-populated. You can put in a POC. So this would be someone at the installation, and you might want to include a phone number in case you had follow-up questions for that person. So the finding type is either compliance or EMS. This is a compliance issue. And oops. And so once you select compliance, the category becomes either regulatory or policy. This is a policy or regulatory issue. Class tier and tier are voluntary fields if you want to identify it as class 1 to 3 or tier installation practice or region level. And then put in a descriptive name. So I'm going to say improper storage of universal waste lamps. You're going to write down a preliminary root cause. The installation will have the ability to later record what they believe the final root cause is. And we're going to say that it was a training issue. So the person, when talking to the personnel there, will pretend that they simply didn't know that it was supposed to be disposed of prior to 1 year. So we're going to say training is inadequate or ineffective. Note that the description or evidence got carried over from the checklist, so that's nice. And then you would write down what the required actions would be. So have the used lamps properly prepared for disposal and removed as soon as possible. So that remediates the immediate finding, but then you also want to try and remediate the root cause. So we'll add in trained personnel and contractors on the proper storage and management of universal waste. Maintain all records according to procedure and inventory. Then the other fields are what reference did they violate? This is a CFR. You can tell that by the citation code that was carried over from the checklist. ISO reference. So what ISO element is applicable? In this case, it would be legal and other requirements. Checklist name gets pre-populated, item ID, citation code, and the requirement, boom, all from the checklist. You can see that the related equipment, that specific equipment gets pre-populated. If there was a related finding, like it was a repeat finding, then you could also link this to that repeat finding. If you are doing an internal review, you can select what the review group is from your audit inspection personnel groups. In this case, we're not doing it. So I'm going to go ahead and save and finalize this finding. Okay, so now we've created this finding. And now we can look at the profile for this finding. So do notice that every finding has the capability of having a POAM associated with it, and you can look at the associated POAM just by clicking on this secondary tab on the finding. You have links to the checklist that this finding was generated from, and you also have a link to the inspection that this finding belongs to. Under the general information and details, you have all of the information that was entered in for the finding, as well as under citation, you have all the citation information. We have another field here titled Status and History. So the current status is it is open and it has not been assigned. So while the finding is open, there are several steps that it can go through before it is closed. And then there are some instructions as to what should happen to this finding in the process. So here it says that the lead auditor should use the assign button, and that is located up at the top, and assign the finding and define what the resolution requirements are. Okay, and then the review status is that this finding has been finalized. The approved date is the date that the POAM was approved. And then you have a little history section. So it's going to show you every time that this finding changes status. So here you can see that it entered the open not assigned status. It was initiated by this Atlantis auditor user, and on what date. Under related items, you have information from the finding. So you can see it's related to anti-syncing device number 4. And then you have any related documents to this finding. So you can click on this finding and on this finding documents link, and then you can upload files that are specific to this finding. Or you can attach some existing documents from the document tab within EMS Web. So if it already exists as a document in EMS Web, there's no need to re-upload it. You can just link to it, and that's what this button is used for. So I'm going to upload a file from my computer, and I'm just going to take this example Excel file just as an example. So you can see that the system will upload it, it will refresh the page, it'll show you the file name, who uploaded it, when, and you can just click on it to download that file. So you can go back to the finding by clicking on the finding name, and then under finding documents, you can now see that there is a finding document. Okay, so the buttons that the lead auditor has available is they can unfinalize it, which means that they can send it back to draft status, change any of the necessary finding fields, or they can delete it because findings in draft status can be deleted. Or they can also delete it straight from this area. Only lead auditors have that capability on an external audit. Here's the assign button, which is the next step in the finding closure process. They can edit it, and then they also have various exports that they can run for this finding. So they can create various reports and exports. Okay, so now if we go back to the inspection, so under this link 2, I can click on the inspection name, and I go back to the inspection profile. So now when I scroll down, I can see that under the finding and observation table, there is now this one finding, and it shows me all of the information. So here's the finding, the name, what media it belongs to, category, status, preliminary root cause. You'll notice that the POAM target completion date is blank, progress is NA, POAM status is NA, because the POAM has not yet been created. So from the inspection profile, I can go ahead and create a new finding from scratch. I can also create a new observation, just like I could from the checklist. So let's go ahead and create a new observation. So an observation is kind of like a finding, but it can be used to denote issues that may become findings in the future. It can, but we have categories of observations. So we can also document things that are going well, that are noteworthy, things that they are doing. We might just write down an observation of something that might become an issue in the future. We can write down a positive observation. Hey, this thing that we see you guys doing is something that's really good for the program. And you can put down recommendations as well. We recommend that you do the following actions to improve your EMS program. So I'm just going to create a basic observation, define a media for it, say EMS program, and put down a subject name, training program at 100% attendance or participation. So let's just say their training program, was excellent and that they had everybody trained. And so this is just a way to document that they did something really well. And then all of the other fields are voluntary. So if there are no actions for them to take, you can leave it blank. If there's an ISO reference, you can put it down if you want to. And then you can save and finalize it. So observations are much quicker to create than findings. There are very few mandatory fields. But because you have the ability to make recommendations, you can also create a POAM for it if desired, and you can also close it out. There really is no downside to leaving observations open because it's never pulled into any type of reports like findings are. So the table on the inspection profile will list both findings and observations. You can copy a finding from one place to another. And so you can find a finding. So here is a observation finding. Actually, whoops. So then it's going to pre-populate this new finding form with all of the information that was on the finding that you selected. So if you have a finding that's like a repeat finding, then you can select the original finding, and most of all that information will be pre-populated. Or if there's a similar finding that's already there, you can also select that and get all of the information pre-populated. Then you can just update the fields as desired and save it. Okay, so do note if you try to save a finding without the mandatory fields filled out, it will show you which ones need to be filled out and with some information. So I'm just going to save this as a draft. When in a draft, you don't have to have all of the mandatory fields filled out. It's only when you try to finalize it that you do. So a copy finding can save you some time if you have a similar finding that's already at your installation. So the last thing I want to show you is a carryover finding. So a carryover finding is a finding that's open. It has a POAM, and what you want to do is you want to carry that open finding from one audit or inspection to another. And so what's going to happen is it's going to copy the finding from the original and create a copy of it in the new audit and inspection. And then it's going to go back to the original finding, close it out, close out that finding, close out all of the associated information like the POAM. So if it has an existing POAM, let's take a look at, let's say this one, this finding for external EMS audit. So this is a finding that has been created previously. Okay, so, and it has an associated POAM to it. That POAM that I could tell from the finding was 50% complete. Okay, so it had two milestones. One was completed, one wasn't started yet. So I'm going to pretend that I want to carry over this finding to a new audit. One requirement on this is that you can only carry over findings from the same type of audit. Unfortunately, let's see, this finding does not have an audit type, so I can't use it. So let me go back and pick a different finding. Okay, so here's another finding. It is related to this test external audit that was created quite a number of years ago. So because of that, it also does not have a audit type because it's so old. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to filter this grid by last action, so that way I can get a test finding that is somewhat recent. So here are the findings, two findings that I just entered in. Okay, so here is an example finding. Okay, so this is linked to another audit, and it is a Tier 2 inspection audit. So I'm going to edit this finding and change the name so that I can easily find it again. So I'm going to put a training number on it, modify the finding number so it has training in the title. So what I can do then is I can go to a, well actually, I'm going to keep that previous tab open so I can show you what happens to this finding when it goes to the carryover. And I'm going to go to a Tier 2 inspection. So here I have this Tier 2 example inspection. And now I'm going to initiate a carryover finding by first going to a new finding. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to scroll down to the related findings, and then I'm going to link this to that carryover finding that I want to pick. So here I have this training one that I picked. And now it comes up with a pop-up saying, okay, this finding is eligible to be a carryover finding because it was open, it had a POAM, and it belonged to the same type of inspection. So if I do this carryover, it's going to copy over the information from the finding that I chose to this new finding. And then when I finalize this finding, the original finding will be closed. So I'm going to say, yes, carry it over. And so then all of the information from that original finding that I selected gets carried over to this new finding. You can then adjust it as needed. So if so for any information that's relevant to this current inspection for this carryover finding, you can add in. Then when I save and finalize it, there are going to be a couple of differences between doing this and a copy finding. One is that the finding number retains the old finding number, but it adds in the K standing for carryover that was carried over in 2019. So it picks off the current year for that. Also note that when I go to the POAM, that it retained the POAM for the carryover finding. Okay, so the POAM is still a work in progress, and everything that was, all of the information for the carryover findings POAM got added into this new POAM. So now let's go back to the original finding, and I'm going to look at the POAM for that original finding. So now you can see that the original finding POAM got updated to 100% complete. It got closed out, the POAM did, and under the plan of action and synopsis, this additional verbiage got added in that said that this POAM was closed as a carryover finding, and then it puts down the new carryover finding number. So if you wanted to track it down, you could find out. If we look at the original finding, we can now see that the finding status is closed. Under the history, it says under today's date that this person closed it because as part of a carryover finding, and the new finding number is also listed here. So the main difference between using a carryover finding and a new finding is that in a carryover finding, the old finding gets closed out and the POAM gets associated with the new finding. Okay, so this is a very clean way of when you have recurring audits like your external audits or your internal audits, that you're able to keep all of the open findings in the current external or internal audit, and allows you to close out all of the findings from the previous audit.